Votre Altesse, je suis vraiment très ému, très touché. Je n'ai plus rien à dire que merci, merci beaucoup. To Governor General, Mrs. Johnson, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and members of the board of the Center, it is a pleasure for me to join you here today and to deliver this lecture. The Global Center for Pluralism has an extremely important mandate, and I feel privileged to participate in its work. I was a bit worried when John said, you all know Kofi Annan. When he started that way, usually he says, here is a man who doesn't need any introduction. That can be very dangerous. You know, when I stepped down, my wife and I went for a holiday in the Como region. And I said, 3 months, let's hide, no television, no radio, no newspaper. After 6 weeks of this, I began to get bored. So I said, let's go to the tobacconist to see if we can get a newspaper. We had barely entered the shop when I noticed a group of 5 men in the corner staring at us. And one of them broke away and made directly for me. And I said to my wife, gosh, we have 6 weeks to go, and we have broken our cover. How are we going to manage? By then, the fellow was on top of me, and he put his hand out and said, Morgan Freeman. May I have an autograph? I said, sure. And I signed K. Freeman. He was very happy, and we were very happy. Continued our holidays incognito. No. On a more serious note, globalization has brought us closer together. In the 21st century, we live for the first time in one global community. But it is a community composed of many strands which must be carefully woven together into a whole. If diversity is seen as a source of strength, societies can become healthier, more stable, and prosperous. But there is another side of the coin if we fail to manage the conflicting pressures that pluralism invariably brings. Without the institutions and policies to manage diversity, whole communities can be marginalized and oppressed, creating conditions for conflict and violence. This is why pluralism is a key challenge for the 21st century. Some look at the recent developments and claim that our world is becoming fragmented into different civilizations. I strongly disagree. I see the world coming together in one global civilization to which each of us brings our own traditions, cultures, and beliefs. My long experience has taught me that whatever our background, what unites us is far greater than what divides us. By experience, my own experience has taught me that strong, healthy, cohesive societies are built on 3 pillars: peace and security, development, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. Unfortunately, stability and economic growth have for far too long been the principal responses to national and global problems. We tend to look at those as key elements that we need. If I were to ask some in this room 3 years ago, what do you think of Tunisia, for example? The answer would have been great country, great tourist destination, is peaceful, is stable, and economically is doing well. Very few would have spoken to me about the 3rd pillar: rule of law and respect for human rights. And yet it is that pillar that led to what we are witnessing in North Africa. I think we must not fall into that trap. For there can be no long-term security without development, and no long-term development without security. And no society can long remain prosperous or secure without respect for rule of law and human rights. For a society to manage pluralism successfully, it must embrace and give equal weight to each of these three pillars. But ladies and gentlemen, we must not shy away from the fact that plural societies by their nature are challenging to govern. They bring with them competing claims and entitlements, each of which can be justified and defended, but which are not always compatible. And it is important to recognize that no society, however democratic or respectful of the rule of law, resolves these challenges perfectly. Europe, for example, has well-established legal systems and arrangements to protect minorities and reach acceptable compromises. Yet, within Europe, pluralism is sometimes seen as a threat. Levels of social prejudice have been rising against religious and cultural minorities and new immigrants. We have also seen a fall in trust and confidence in political institutions, which has led to increased support for more extreme political groupings. These trends underline how important it is for countries to entrench democratic principles and norms, adopt inclusive policies to build and sustain trust, increase inclusion, and reduce insecurity. And just as no country is born a democracy, no one is born a good citizen. Mutual respect and tolerance have to be fostered and taught. We have to promote dialogue to combat fear, intolerance, and extremism. We have to learn from each other, making our different traditions and cultures a source of harmony and strength, not discord and weakness. The Center must help us do that, and it will have plenty of work to do. Let's not imagine that it can come up with a simple one-size-fits-all formula that will solve the problems of diversity in all societies. Diversity is about difference, and there is diversity among countries and within countries. The mix of policies and institutions required, for example, to manage relations between indigenous communities and a majority of long-established incomers is not the same as that required to integrate and protect new minorities who have only recently arrived. Many countries have to manage both situations at once. Canada is one, and it has done so more successfully than most, although I'm sure a few Canadians would argue or claim that there is no problems left to solve. Canada's prosperity, as well as its political system and strong institutions, including an independent judiciary, make it relatively well placed to deal with these challenges. But in countries without such advantages, tensions all too often spill over into violence and conflict, leading in the worst cases to ethnic cleansing and genocide, such as we saw in Rwanda and in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Again, the origins of these stresses are different in each country. Most often, majorities hold a minority group responsible for their problems, or see it as a threat and turn on it in a fury. But there are also cases where we saw in South Africa where minority clings to power and privilege, partly because it fears what will happen if power passes on to the majority. Each of these cases involve different realities and different conditions. Each requires a different approach, but most have this in common. Though these conflicts have security implications, they are, in essence, political problems requiring political solutions. While numerous political factors come into play, resolution of these conflicts often requires action to tackle long-standing injustice and discrimination. This was certainly the case in Kenya, a country in which I've been closely involved after sectarian violence exploded following the elections in 2007. Kenya has successfully projected a vision of peace and stability, so the violence in which over 1,000 people were killed and 650 people displaced shocked the world. And I will tell you, above all, it shocked the Kenyans too. But this image was not rooted in reality. The truth is that widespread corruption and crony capitalism had fueled a deep-seated sense of anger and grievance across the country. Kenya's political elite had sadly adopted the divide and rule approach of its former colonial rulers, with little attempt to build a cohesive national identity. Wealth and influence were passed between interchanging ethnic cliques. The rule of law had become less important than tribal bloodlines. But while a few at the top amassed great wealth, which they spread to their close kin, the vast majority of the country's citizens lived in abject poverty. This fueled despair and resentment, which exploded in the aftermath of the election, exposing the deep rifts within Kenyan society. The violence was terrible, but I and many others were aware that far worse shadow of Rwanda and Bosnia hung over Kenya. Within a week of the crisis, there were serious economic shortages in the neighboring countries, from Uganda to Rwanda to Eastern Democratic Congo and southern Sudan. This threat thankfully led to a concerted international response from within Africa and outside Africa, which persuaded Kenya's warring leaders to agree to mediation. By the time the team of eminent African personalities, that is what we were called, I'm not calling myself that, but they gave us that title, the team of African eminent personalities comprising of Benjamin Mkapa, former president of Tanzania, Graça Machel, the wife of Nelson Mandela, and myself. By the time we arrived, we had the undivided backing of the African Union, the UN, the US, and the whole international community, the European Union, were solidly behind that effort. Such support made a huge difference and helped us eventually to persuade President Kibaki and Raila Odinga to agree to power sharing. But it was clear that what was needed was wide-ranging reform to address the country's deeper tensions and the failure of the political system. We were not there to rearrange the chairs for the political elite. This required engagement not just from the political elite, but right across Kenyan society through the Kenyan National Dialogue and reconciliation process. And I can assure you the Kenyan civil society played a very important role, from women's organizations, religious leaders, civil rights activists, media owners, and the business community. They all were involved with us from the beginning to now. And it was the Kenyan people who worked very hard with us to pull the situation, to bring the situation under control. This process, as we heard His Highness say, delivered a new constitution, overwhelmingly supported in a national referendum, which provided Kenya with the chance to start afresh and also to set an example for the continent and other countries beyond Africa. I think today they have perhaps one of the most modern constitutions, with Bill of Rights, chapters on integrity, and a whole range of issues. It opened the way for a much fairer political system built around devolved government, a new Bill of Rights, land reform, and a permanent reduction in presidential powers. It gave each county and each community, including all its tribal and regional groups, access to power, a welcome antidote to the destructive winner-takes-all politics, which has been a problem on my continent and in other situations. Reforms were put in place to strengthen the effectiveness and independence and trust in the judiciary, police, and electoral commission, whose weaknesses had helped inflame the violence. Alongside reform, the political system work was begun to tackle the divisive political culture. Through the work of the Commission of Inquiry into Post-Election Violence and the Truth and Justice and Reconciliation Commission, Kenya began to look at not just the immediate events which led to the violence, but the country's long history of human rights abuses. At the same time, the National Cohesion and Integration Commission was established to identify and eliminate all forms of discrimination. Our aim was not to put a plaster over the wound, but to try to help Kenya find a permanent solution to its deep divisions. In the past 5 years, it is to be welcomed, and to the credit of the country and its people, that many of these reforms have been put in place. Perhaps not perfectly, but they've been put in place. We saw as well how the recent elections passed off largely peacefully and successfully. But the poll also confirmed that work must continue to reduce negative ethnicity and strengthen Kenya's institutions and electoral management bodies. It is also far from clear that efforts to reform the culture of Kenya's political leaders have taken hold. Reconstructing sound political institutions and building trust in them will require continued vigilance and effort over a long period from both inside Kenya and from Kenya's friends on the international scene. There are no shortcuts, and unfortunately, progress can be quickly undone. But the rapid intervention of the international community to this crisis did help Kenya pull back from the brink of the abyss. This in contrast to the conflict in Syria, another country where I have been involved, whose trauma and nightmare has been worse in almost every aspect. Here too, for a brief period, the international community had an opportunity to act. Negotiation on a political settlement was, I believe, still possible a year ago. On 30 June 2012, the Action Group for Syria met to agree a comprehensive plan to resolve the conflict. The final communique, and the meeting was attended by the foreign ministers of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, and the 2 secretaries general of the UN and the Arab League, as well as the foreign ministers of Iraq, Qatar, and Kuwait. The final communique established principles and guidelines for a Syrian-led political transition that would meet legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people. These guidelines included the establishment of a transitional governing body with full executive powers to establish a neutral environment for the transition, an inclusive national dialogue, a review of the constitutional order and new legal system, continuity of government institutions, and recruitment of qualified staff, commitment to accountability and national reconciliation, and a comprehensive package for transitional justice and gender equality, protection of vulnerable groups, and provision of humanitarian aid. Had the international community built on this a year ago, and if they had seized this moment rather than lose it, Syria might have avoided the extreme violence that has now cost over 80,000 lives, resulted in 1.5 million refugees, 4 million internally displaced people, and millions more facing daily terror and humiliating struggle for survival. The involvement of regional interest, proxy wars, and the paralysis of the international decision-making, or specifically the Security Council, has created a truly poisonous mix that threatens to spill over into neighboring countries. And unfortunately, the conflict has taken on a deeply sectarian turn. While it is not the primary or sole driver of the conflict, sectarianism and communal violence has risen to the fore. And while, of course, continued unrest in Kenya would have had a serious regional impact and a potential fallout, the potential fallout from Syria is far more dangerous. There's no comparison. And I think we should be aware of this. Syria is an important country in a region that is strategic, diverse, and unstable. Syria, unlike Libya, has not imploded. If anything, it is likely to explode and explode beyond its own borders. For example, there is increased risk of ethnic conflict between Arab Sunni insurgents and Kurdish forces that could drag in Turkey. The violence threatens to spill over to Lebanon and Iraq. Some would say it already has, sparking conflicts amongst their own communities. Rising tensions between Gulf states and Iran and the deepening of Sunni-Shia divisions could also increase regional instability. This has already greatly complicated attempts to find political solution, and I dare say it will greatly complicate the implementation of eventual post-conflict settlement. But I still believe that the conflict can be ended through mediation and dialogue. So I am glad and encouraged that Russia and the United States are working together to organize what they call a Geneva II conference. This is expected next month if others do not succeed in derailing it. It is imperative that the international community unites behind a plan to create new political arrangements that will be fairer, more tolerant, and more accountable. Only with such unity can we hope to bring a halt to 2 years of violence and suffering. Ladies and gentlemen and dear friends, Kenya and Syria are two different examples from my own experience which in a way show why the Aga Khan and the Canadian government are to be commended for having the vision, the generosity to create the center. Sound policy advice on pluralism is indispensable to the creation of stable, fair societies where people can fulfill themselves and live together in harmony. But to be effective, such advice also requires the understanding that solutions have to be tailored for the unique situation of every individual society. This is where the center's role would be invaluable. The different examples of Kenya and Syria, however, also underline the indispensable role the international community can and must play in helping diffuse conflicts. In a world more interconnected than ever, it would be wrong and reckless to believe that we can be indifferent to any country's trauma or nightmare, or let alone national interests persuade us to stand back and do nothing. I wish the center success and well in its endeavors. It is hard to overestimate either the urgency or the importance of that work. Thank you very much.